Hi, this is Emma from Emma's Art-Tastic Creations, and today I'm going to be talking about some interesting stories revolving interdimensional travel. And I'm going to be reading some off of this list from List First. So, this is the source right here. I will also put it in the description of the video. You just have to click the little arrow and you'll see the link in the description and you can read this for yourself. But I just thought these were really interesting and I wanted to talk about them because I just find interdimensional stuff to be interesting. That's why I find the Mandela effect to be interesting. And people can agree or disagree what's really going on there, but I personally like to think it has to do with crossing over into other dimensions. So, anyways, this is just a list of some people who allegedly, and remember I'm saying allegedly, crossed over from another dimension. And now some of these on this list I have actually done some additional research on, and they are actually fake stories, or they've been proven not to be true later on. So I will briefly talk about them, but I'm not going to go too deep into them because they've been proven as hoaxes or someone has proved that they're not true. So without further ado, here is the list. Number 10 is The Man from Tarad. Now, I think this is one of my favorite dimensional stories. So allegedly, there was a guy, and in 1954, he flew into the Tokyo International Airport. And he handed over his passport to be stamped, but he was stopped, by the guards at the airport. And they wanted to know where he was flying in from. And his passport looked authentic. However, the country, when they were looking over his records, they had never heard of the country that he was supposedly from, which was called Torad or however you pronounce that. He said it was located between France and Spain, which is really interesting. And then he was asked to point it out on a map, and he pointed to the Principality of Andorra, which makes it even more interesting to me. And he said he had never heard of Andorra, and Torad had existed for 1,000 years. He claimed that he was in Japan on business, and he had been flying in and out of this airport for 5 years. And it seemed, when they looked at his passport, it seemed to back up the story because it was covered in, the visa stamps, and he had legal currency from several European countries, which kind of backed up what he was talking about. He had a driver's license and a checkbook from an unknown bank in this Torad place, or Torad, however you pronounce it. And he was sent to a nearby hotel after being interrogated because they weren't really sure what to do with him. I mean, because he's like this guy who seemingly came from nowhere. And there were supposedly some guards who stood on either side of his hotel room. And then in the morning, they had discovered, when they went to retrieve him again and try to maybe interrogate him more or try to figure out what was going on, he had vanished. And he was 15 stories above in a hotel, and basically he just vanished from nowhere. There's been a lot of speculations about this, and you can look into it yourself. Is some people say that he was a spy, and the reason why they couldn't find any information about him or his, where he was from, was because he was just a made-up person from a made-up place, and it made it easier for him, going from place to place. Although one has to wonder, you think he would have been stopped before. Somebody would have looked at his passport and gone, hey, wait a minute, what's that place? He was before. Now, some people say this never happened, and it was a fabricated story. And I remember watching like some kind of it was like a documentary about this or something a few years. It had to be a couple years back, but they were saying how they had looked in the Japanese records, and uh, they didn't find anything, I think, as my memory serves, from the Japanese side of things, as far as they could tell from that specific time period, 1954. It could be that something has surfaced since then because, um, I haven't done any research into it for like a couple years, but anyway, it could be that maybe the records were lost. Maybe they just it was recorded from some other end, like a European person got involved and it got recorded from another place. I mean, who knows? But anyway, it did seem to be kind of a popular urban legend in Japan, and it made its way over because somebody published a book, I guess, a little bit after this happened, many years later. And in the book was the story, um, which the author went into some pretty good detail about, more detail than this article did. And based on just what people had been told and what they had heard. And I think there were some airport records, but they weren't like really talking about him in particular, but there were like some odd things that happened around that time. It's just like he was never specifically mentioned, as I said before. So it's just really interesting. I mean, who knows? Maybe it is just an urban legend that made its way into a book and everyone just thought it was true because it was in a book later. Maybe it really happened and the records were lost. Maybe it was a spy. And maybe they do know who the spy is, but, to keep the public not as scared or something, they just never mentioned it. So who knows, right? It's kind of an interesting mystery. So anyways, the second one is, what if the Beatles never broke up? Now with this one, somebody created a site. His name is James Richard, and he claimed that he was chasing his dog through the Del Porto Canyon in California, September 9th, 2009. He tripped into a rabbit hole, like Alice in Wonderland, right? He knocked himself unconscious, and when he woke up, he found himself in a room next to an unrecognizable machine and a man who introduced himself as Jonas. And according to the man, while on a work-related trip for a dimensional travel agency, he had used the machine to transport the unconscious Richards to a parallel Earth. And in this parallel Earth, he supposedly he didn't believe the guy at first, and then they started to talk about things, and then he brought up the fact that the Beatles were still together in their dimension, and he even put in the music and showed him that, yeah, they're together, here's some songs. And sure enough, there were songs that had never been on an album here, because the Beatles had broken up. So allegedly he brought that tape or something back to Earth after saying goodbye to Jonas as proof that he had been in this alternate dimension. And I'm not going into this one too much because, I mean, obviously this one is fake. That they figured out later that the tape that he, allegedly had brought back from this other dimension was actually just songs that Beatles had recorded but had been kind of like lesser known songs and were never put on the same CD. Some of them were unreleased, but fans would know the songs because they were kind of underground Beatles songs. So it's not like it was anything that was never recorded on Earth, and the album was obviously just put together by him. So I mean, it's a fun story and stuff, but it's not true. Okay, now this one is about okay, apparently someone on Twitter is trying to talk to me. This one is called Ong's Hat. Now, in Ong's Hat, New Jersey, was founded sometime in the 19th century by a man named Ong after he threw his hat up in the air and he lost it in a tree branch, or maybe it slipped into another dimension, as the article person says. And by the 1920s, the cities had become a ghost town, but Ong's hat was not forgotten. And on the contrary, the abandoned town became the topic for one of the earliest internet-based conspiracy theories. And during the 1970s and 80s, a new scientific paradigm called chaos, which is concerning with everyday experiences such as the sound of a fan or the buzzing of a computer, began to gain popularity. A lot of that actually was because of Jurassic Park and because, as everyone knows, there's a character in there who brings up chaos theory a lot. So it got into the public consciousness. But anyway, two chaos scientists named Frank and Alethea Dobbs developed a theory that consciousness could be modeled as its own universe, and if one could master one's own mind map, the ability to control the chaos and possibly travel to other dimensions would be achieved. So according to a long debunked hoax pamphlet, 3 other chaos scientists joined the Dobbses in founding the Underground Institute of Chaos Studies in Ong's Hat, New Jersey, and it was there they discovered the gate to an alternate dimension by putting scientists in a modified sensory deprivation chamber called the Egg, and allegedly they succeeded and mastered the science of interdimensional travel. And on their explorations, they discovered a world that had never developed human life but sustained plant life and water, which is where the chaos scientists were said to reside ever since. So this, of course, is just science fiction because, as you see, there was like a pamphlet that was shown to be debunked and stuff. But it's an interesting story, regardless. So I just thought I'd share. Won't get too into it though because it's obviously debunked. Now here we have Carol Chase Michelini, I believe is how you say that. And in 2006, Carol Chase Michelini was driving from Paris, California, back to her home in San Bernardino, and she claimed she decided to stop in her hometown of Riverside. It didn't take long, however, for Carol to realize she wasn't in the right town, although its geographical location was correct. She claimed she couldn't find her childhood home or those of her family members, and in fact, she didn't recognize any of those houses, even though all the numbers were still correct. And even the cemetery where her grandparents were buried was just a fenced and full of a bunch of overgrown weeds. Was she simply in the wrong town? This would be a strong theory had she not found some landmarks that were familiar, such as the college, the middle school, and actually some other articles say that she basically drove around everywhere and it looked just like her town, but like not like her town. It was weird. However, her relief in finding something recognizable was short-lived, as she soon noticed the eerie vibes surrounding the Riverside residents who were walking around. She soon left, afraid to approach any of these sinister beings. And in some articles, it says, and other things, if you research it online, it says that it was like they were almost really creepy and they didn't notice she was there, like, I don't know if you're familiar with shadow people, but like how shadow people, sometimes people encounter them, they're like these shadow figures, they're like made of a shadowy material. And it's like a lot of times they just kind of move along like they don't even see you. And so that's kind of how the people of this town were, except that they were like living, breathing beings. It's just that they didn't really pay her any regard. And if they did, they gave her kind of like a weird vibe. So anyway, she believed she had stumbled into a parallel dimension in which Riverside was a much darker place. And that went along with the fact that everything was overgrown and just weird and unfamiliar. Her story can't be confirmed because she returned to Riverside a few years later for her father's funeral, and it had reverted back down to the town she knew as a child, and she never encountered the alternate dimension Riverside ever again. So yeah, like that's the same as another, other accounts of the story is she left like right away that one time, and she just went, I'm not going, I'm not staying here. This is weird. And apparently she just she returned home or something. But then she did go back, and she had, I guess, reservations about it, and she's going, I don't know, like I don't want to be in this weird place again. But yeah, when she went back the second time, it was exactly like she remembered it, and she never went back to that place again. So it's really interesting. And some people, of course, say that, maybe she was just like in the wrong town. But she insists, that she was in the right place because she remembered all the landmarks. And if you read other stories, like she was driving around for quite some time just trying to figure out, what was going on. And it was all things she remembered. It was just that it was like overgrown and weird and different. So it's kind of an interesting story. All right, so now we have Lorena Garcia. And in July 2008, a well-educated 41-year-old woman named Lorena Garcia woke up in her bed on what seemed like an ordinary day. However, as she went on with her normal routine, she claimed she found small details that seemed peculiar. For example, her sheets and pajamas were different from what she remembered. And she resolved to brush off this curiosity and drove to her place of work where she had been employed for 20 years. However, upon arriving at her department, she realized it wasn't actually her department, despite being in its usual location on its usual floor. And having decided that something weird was definitely going on, she returned home only to find the man from whom she said she had separated 6 months before, who acted like the separation had never taken place. Her new lover, whom she claimed she had been seeing for 4 months, was nowhere to be found. And even after hiring a private detective, his whereabouts remain unknown, and there was no trace of him at his alleged residence or any trace of his family. While it seems likely that Garcia's perceptions are the result of some neurological malfunction, she believes she woke up in a parallel universe. And unfortunately for the alleged dimensional traveler, Garcia has not been able to return to her normal activities, leaving her stuck in a dimension where she doesn't belong with a boyfriend she can't get rid of. So yeah, allegedly, as I read, her job situation was different. She was with a guy she had supposedly broken up with. The other guy she was with was completely never found again. And yeah, she still lives like this to this life. It isn't like the other lady where, things just went back to normal. No, to this day, she's still with this guy she supposedly broke up with. She's still in this job that's like completely different from the job that she's allegedly had before. And there's different speculations, like some people say she, like I read, she has some neurological issue and maybe it's like a form of amnesia or, I'm not a psychologist, but maybe it's something where she had a temporary neurological issue, which made her believe that she was someone she wasn't. I mean, who knows? But it is really interesting how she's just so convinced, even today, that she had this whole other life. And, just to go into that amount of detail about what her life supposedly was, I mean, it's just really interesting. So, okay, so now we have the story of Pedro Olivia Ramirez. And at around 11 p.m. on November 9th, 1986, Pedro Olivia Ramirez claims he was driving from Seville, Spain, to the town of Alcalá de Guadera, hopefully I pronounced it right, and being no stranger to this track, it came as a surprise when he allegedly went around a curve and found himself driving on an unfamiliar 6-lane highway. He was surrounded by foreign structures and bizarre terrain, and he felt a sense of heat, while a chorus of voices rang out in the distance, and one voice stood out among the others, telling him that he had just been teleported to another dimension. Apparently, they like to announce it when you go dimension hopping, right? Anyways, the cars around him, which passed at intervals of exactly 8 minutes, were outdated and either white or beige, with dark, narrow rectangles for license plates. And after about an hour of confusing driving, Ramirez found a turnoff to his left where signs stood pointing to Alcabala, Malaga, and Seville. So Ramirez began driving towards Seville, but when he stopped, he was astonished to find he was looking at his home at Alcalá de Guadera. And when he retraced his steps, he could not locate the crossroads, the road sign, or the 6-lane highway again. So this is another story like the woman in the other story where she went to that town and then she left, but then when she went back again, it was like it was just the way it was before. In this case, he was on a highway. The highway momentarily, became this weird thing he had never seen before, and then all of a sudden he found himself home, even though it was like a far distance away. But when he went back, the highway wasn't there anymore. So in this case, it was kind of like a weird interdimensional highway, which is an interesting metaphor, right? The highway between dimensions. So, and on top of that, there were voices telling him he had arrived in another dimension. So, I don't know. Interesting. Okay, so number 4 is Gedanten Canyon. In May 1972, 4 girls were allegedly driving back to Southern Utah University after spending their Saturday at a rodeo in Paiute. And while crossing the desolate Utah-Nevada state line at around 10 p.m., they came upon a fork in the highway where they veered to the left and began driving through Gedanten Canyon. Gedanten, I think that's how you say it. And suddenly the black pavement turned to a white cement. Believing they had simply taken a wrong turn, the girls headed back the way they came. But to their surprise, they were suddenly driving past grain fields and ponderosa pines with no desert in sight. They decided to stop at a roadside tavern to ask for directions, but quickly changed their minds after one of the girls began screaming hysterically. 4 egg-shaped vehicles mounted on tricycle wheels with bright light shining from the top of them began speeding after them. The petrified girls sped back through the canyon as the white cement changed back to its normal black asphalt, leading them to a familiar desert. And after wrecking in a creek, leaving them with 3 flat tires, they waited until morning to hike to Highway 56, where they flagged down an obviously skeptical state trooper. And as outlandish as their stories seem, their tire tracks they left are difficult to explain. The only tire tracks left by the girls' Chevy ended abruptly only 200 meters, about 600 feet into the desert, which leaves the mystery of how the girls ended up 3 kilometers or 2 miles north of the highway with no physical evidence of their travels. And the car was also missing a hubcap that was never located, and maybe it got lost somewhere in the Utah desert, or maybe it's being displayed at a museum on a parallel Earth. Could be, right? That's kind of an interesting one. And this is one where I'm kind of like, it could have happened, but at the same point in time, I kind of have this thought in my head that maybe they were like drinking and driving, or maybe they were like doing drugs or something, and they didn't want to get in trouble for it, so they kind of made up an elaborate story, and that's kind of what I think happened in this case. However, I do think that the story about the highway, where the guy went into a highway and then it just disappeared, and the one with the lady where she went to a town and she returned to it and it was different, I think those have a very real chance of being real stories, because I've kind of encountered similar things in my own life, which maybe I'll go into in another video, but it's consistent with what I've experienced. So, I do think those stories have some credibility. Okay, now, the Montauk Project. Probably a lot of people have heard of this. And based out of an abandoned Air Force radar station on the eastern end of Long Island, the Montauk Project was a series of top-secret United States government experiments following the Philadelphia experiment, whose purpose was to create the technology to render ships invisible to radar detection. And the 1943 project was almost too much of a success, as the USS Eldridge supposedly went literally invisible before being teleported into another dimension, eventually reappearing off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. And because many of the crew died, when the project went wrong and those who didn't were driven to the brink of insanity, official funding for the Philadelphia experiment was pulled. However, scientists and military officials were fascinated with the experiment's results and wanted to continue exploring the possibilities of teleportation and interdimensional travel. So the Montauk Project was launched in the 1960s. Headed by Dr. John von Neumann, the Montauk Project focused on examining the psychological changes of those who traveled through dimensions and determining why the Philadelphia experiment was a disaster despite its achievements in teleportation. According to their theories, humans are born with a time reference point that is linked to the electromagnetic fields unique to this Earth and dimension. And this is why such a dramatic jump to another dimensional plane was detrimental to so many of the crew, causing insanity and death. And during the Montauk Project experiments, von Neumann solved this problem by creating a computer-simulated Earth and altering the body's time reference points. So that's kind of interesting because it kind of goes hand in hand with what people say about CERN today, doesn't it? In a lot of ways. According to the documents on the Montauk Project, von Neumann succeeded at sending people to other dimensions without a consequence. However, upon the experiment's completion in 1967, a report was sent to Congress on their findings about mind control and interdimensional travel. Congress halted funding and terminated the project, fearing of mass mind control. This one, I've heard a lot of people talk about. It could have been the foundation of the CERN project, who knows? This one I'm not too sure about, though. It's been talked about a lot. There's the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk project are two things that are discussed a lot. However, I do not know, I'm not completely sure of their validity. There's supposed military people who have spoken out and said, yeah, I was part of this. Personally, though, I'm not so sure. It kind of sounds, they probably did do interesting experiments and things like that, but I just don't think that it was to the level as what's put out there. And I think there's a lot of tall tales that have come out of it, and I think a lot of people publish things kind of to get famous because everyone else was publishing things about that subject, and they're like, hey, that's some easy way to make some money off of books, and lots of books, trust me, sold about the subject. So I'm I don't know if I believe this one, but it's interesting. Okay, so number 2 is kind of what I was talking about before, and that's shadow people. So according to Albert Einstein, there are 4 dimensions, 3 of space and 1 of time, with the special property of the ability to bend light. And Stephen Hawking furthered this theory by questioning the possibility of many more dimensions existing in the realm of our universe. However, according to Hawking, matter and light are confined to the membrane of the dimension, making interdimensional travel impossible because space-time has the ability to bend light. However, there exists the possibility that we can see the shadows of people and even galaxies from other dimensions in our own, as they can also see us as shadows in the other places, which is actually kind of interesting. So, supposed encounters with these shadowy people are common in North America, and one tale describes a woman meeting with the mysterious entities as a little girl while living in Dorchester, Massachusetts during the mid-1990s. And during her first night, sleeping in a new room, she claims to have seen a tall and unnatural shadow on the wall, and to her surprise, the shadow stepped off the wall and glided around the room, wearing what appeared to be glasses, of all things. And she saw 3 more of these shadow people near her closet. She eventually realized the large shadow was slowly enveloping her entire room, leaving her in a pitch darkness before she leaped from her bed to take comfort in her grandparents' room. And she believes that what she encountered that night were dimensional travelers who most likely saw her as a shadow person. So, very, the whole thing about seeing people as shadows like in other galaxies and stuff is really interesting. And because there is some scientific validity to that, I do believe it happens, and I do have some personal stories, but I will talk about that in another video. Okay, so number 1 is the Marcahuasi Stone Forest. The Marcahuasi Stone Forest lies in the Andes Mountains in Lima, Peru, and the stones are almost like sculptures, taking airy shapes like human faces, but no one is sure how they form. And if that isn't spooky enough, the real mystery is the possibility of a dimensional door that is said to be located in the forest. Now, according to Dr. Raul Rios Santoro, an investigator of the unexplained in Lima, a patient came to see him about her extreme case of hemiplegia, which is a disorder that results in a complete loss of motor function in half of the body. And when he inquired about the woman's condition, she revealed that she had been camping with friends in the Markawasi, and according to the patient, they had gone out exploring late in the night and happened upon a torchlit stone cabin filled with dancing revelers in 17th century attire. The woman said she felt an otherworldly pull towards the cabin, but she was yanked away by one of her friends before she could fully enter. The incident left the side of her body that had entered the cabin paralyzed, and the test results revealed no discernible cause for her paralysis. Centeno believes the woman experienced a dimensional shift, producing a change in her nervous system energy flow. Many natives, as well as scholars, believe that a dimensional doorway exists in the stone forests of Markawaski, which the woman and her friends may have unknowingly crossed. Hemiplegia may not be a great consolation prize, but had she not been pulled away, the woman may have been lost forever. So that's kind of an interesting one too, and I have actually I've read this story in a couple other things, and in the other stories, it often mentions that there's a lot of paranormal stuff that happens in that area with that gateway, and there's actually lots of stories about it. I would actually like to find more stories, so if anyone has any personal stories or any more stories about that gate area, please let me know. Like, leave a comment in the comment section below, because I really want to know more about it. But in this case, it's almost kind of like she went back in time as opposed to going to a parallel dimension. Although she could have done both. She could have gone to a parallel dimension that was also happened to be back in a further time in history, so who knows. But yeah, it's just really interesting, and especially what happened to her body and how she was paralyzed when she got pulled out of the door by her friend. And then it makes you wonder, like, I wonder what would have happened if, for example, she had gone through the door. Like, would she have been stuck there for an amount of time and come back, or would she have just indefinitely been stuck there? Hopefully the people there are friendly, right? But it's really definitely an interesting story, and one, that I could believe it, I got an open mind about this stuff, obviously, having my own personal experiences. So anyway, those are 10 true stories, allegedly, of interdimensional travel, although I established a few of them aren't really true. Like, for example, the Montauk Project and the Philadelphia experiment. I don't know, but if anyone has other information about that I don't know, feel free to let me know in the comments section. And yeah, the Gandayton Canyon or something, I don't know. I think they were just high or stoned, and they were just trying to get themselves out of trouble. What's another one that wasn't necessarily true? Let's see. Ong's hat, that's another one which, like, right in the article it says it was a hoax, so. And the Beatles, even though it's a fun story. And the website, I believe, is actually still up, so it's worth, checking out if you have the time. And, of course, I'm going to leave this link in the description below so you can check all of this out for yourself as well. But anyway, those are 10 true stories of interdimensional travel, and in any case, I think they're all very interesting. The made-up ones just show that people are creative. And the ones that I think are true are truly fascinating, and it just makes you wonder, did these people go into, like, a pocket dimension for a small amount of time, then leave, like the guy on the highway, or the lady who went to her town and then came back and it was normal again, or the lady who only went halfway through the gate before her friend pulled her out. Like, yeah, like what was going on with that? And even the man from Torrid, was he, some neighbors honking their horn. But anyways, yeah, what was he doing? Like, did he enter the pocket dimension, but he's like from the outsider looking in instead of the other direction? So that's really interesting to me. And there's actually, I'm going to do another video. I'd actually like to make this kind of a long running series. And in my other video, I'm going to talk about another guy who's like the man from Torrid, who also allegedly came from a mysterious place that doesn't exist. And I'm really excited to talk about that. But this video has already gone on long enough, so thank you so much for listening, everyone, and you have a nice day.